Georgia tight end Brock Bowers was in the conversation for the Chicago Bears' 9th overall pick all offseason. But then Ryan Poles signed Gerald Everett in free agency and traded for Keenan Allen. And all of a sudden, I'm not sure there's a role left for Bowers in Shane Waldron's offense.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on X at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on all of your favorite social media platforms, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. On the show today, we take a closer look at Brock Bowers now that the Bears' offensive skill positions have changed quite a bit. Now that things are filling in a little bit more, Bowers has dropped out of the conversation a little bit more with the 9th overall pick, but he's still one of the most talented weapons in this draft class, and there's certainly still a contingent of Chicago Bears fans that still want to see Brock Bowers in blue and orange this spring. But we'll kind of look at how he might fit or not fit with what the Bears already have on offense. Can kind of compare to like what a role might look like for Brock Bowers here compared to how he was used in college. And I also want to compare Bowers in that sense to someone like Kyle Pitts from the Atlanta Falcons, who's kind of this more modern mold of how you make a tight end play both wide receiver and tight end in the NFL. And Dalton Kincaid from the Bills kind of falls into this category too. And we'll just kind of look at the overall draft fit for a team like the Chicago Bears that might consider Bowers with that pick. The big changes to the Bears offense have kind of eliminated some of the need for Bowers. You know, when we talked about Bowers, coming through, the NFL Combine process and, after the Senior, he wasn't at the Senior Bowl, but, the early draft conversations around that time, it was like, man, you could put Brock Bowers in there with Cole Kmet and have those two really be a super dynamic tight end duo, and Bowers can play some wide receiver as well and can kind of fill a couple of different holes there and be a versatile weapon for your offense. And those things are still true, but now all of a sudden you have a number 2 tight end already to pair with Cole Kmet, one that Ryan Poles spent a decent chunk of change on. I mean, 2 years, $12 million was not crazy for Gerald Everett by any means, but it averages about $6 million a year. That's going to make him one of the higher paid, if not the highest paid, number 2 tight ends in the NFL. I didn't actually go and look. It's hard to kind of track by number 2 tight ends, but it's definitely up there. And you don't pay Gerald Everett $6 million a year over 2 years just to have him be a end of the bench number, backup tight end who hardly plays. Like, they clearly signed Gerald Everett with the intention of him playing a significant role in this offense as a pass catching weapon who's also can get by as a blocker, as a number 2 tight end there who can also play some wide receiver. Like, he can do some of the kinds of things you would want to ask Brock Bowers to do. And Ryan Poles solidified that with Gerald Everett. And then, of course, you add Keenan Allen to the mix as well, different positions, but given how much Brock Bowers might play at wide receiver, it becomes in that conversation, especially because you think of these tight ends often, the big tight ends being a big slot. And we've seen over the duration of Keenan Allen's career, he's become more of a slot receiver at this stage. He can play outside, absolutely, but he's also been able to be used in the slot more and be able to line up in some different positions in your offense and get different releases off the line of scrimmage, work over the middle of the field and underneath a little bit more from the slot position, as opposed and being a little bit less vertical than he was as a purely outside receiver earlier in his Bears career. So all of a sudden, or earlier in his NFL career, So all of a sudden, you start to look at like where you slot Brock Bowers into this Bears offense, and he's your number 3 tight end after Cole Kmet and Gerald Everett. And he could possibly be your number 3 wide receiver after DJ Moore and Keenan Allen. But is there enough playing time to go around there for, obviously your two receivers are going to get their playing time, but then for Cole Kmet and Gerald Everett and Brock Bowers added on top of that, it's hard to craft out roles and playing time for all of these guys, especially, you think about a Shane Waldron offense here coming from the Sean McVay tree that, yes, in Seattle, Shane Waldron was particularly inclined to use multiple tight ends on the field a lot, but being a part of the Sean McVay tree, like that offense is a overwhelmingly 3 wide receiver, 1 tight end, 1 running back offense, what they call 11 personnel, the 1-1 being 1 running back, 1 tight end. That has to leave 3 wide receivers as your other skill players there. Like even last season in Seattle, where they had some pretty good tight end depth with Noah Fant and Will Dissly and Colby Parkinson, like 3 guys that all got playing time, the Seahawks were still a majority 3 wide receiver team, a vast majority 3 wide receiver team, because they also had DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and the rookie Jackson Smith-Njigba. Like in 2023, the Seahawks offense was 73% of the time their personnel was 3 wide receivers, 1 tight end, 1 running back. They used a lot of 2 tight end sets compared to other teams. It was about 17% of their offense was 2 wide receivers, 2 tight ends, and 1 running back. And they even used more 3 tight end sets than a lot of other teams. About 5.6% of the time, they'd go 3 tight ends, 1 wide receiver, 1 running back. So if you kind of do the combined math here, 3 wide receivers, 73% of the time, your 11 personnel, and then 2 or more tight ends, it's about 22, 23% of the time. So, a little bit more than 1/5, a little less than 1/4, somewhere in between there is about how often you're seeing this offensive coordinator go to multiple tight ends. That's not a ton. It's primarily a 3 wide receiver offense more than anything else. Now, could you consider, just think about Brock Bowers as a wide receiver and use him as the number 3 wide receiver who occasionally plays tight ends, and then you could still run the 3 wide receiver offense, but just make one of those quote unquote wide receivers actually be a tight end. We've seen Waldron be flexible in terms of personnel, be able to get creative with players that can do a lot of different things. And I don't think we can sit here and say, oh no, Shane Waldron would never do that or couldn't find a way to do that. Absolutely. I think, we can start to find some kind of something of piecing together a role here. And I think if I'm the Bears and I'm interested in Brock Bowers and I'm trying to figure out how to make this work, I look at a couple of the other recent hybrid tight end wide receiver prospects that have come out of the NFL draft and been successful with their respective teams. So we'll look at how the Atlanta Falcons used Kyle Pitts and how the Buffalo Bills used Dalton Kincaid and compare that to what Brock Bowers has done in his career to kind of get a sense of if there's a usage here that might work for the Bears offense and work for Brock Bowers next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Game Time is the best way to get tickets for all of your favorite live events. I use Game Time all the time to go to sports games. I went to a couple Bears games using Game Time. I've been to some NBA games as well, and I'm looking forward to getting baseball tickets this summer with Game Time. I've got a bunch of concerts lined up that I've got my tickets on Game Time, plus comedy shows, theater events, pretty much any kind of live entertainment in your area. You can find tickets with Game Time. They've got last minute deals where you can save big, getting the last couple of seats still available. They got flash deals, and I love their all-in pricing so that you see all the fees and everything up front, so you're not getting surprised at the end with added costs that you weren't budgeting in. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create that account and redeem our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Brock Bowers is not the first dynamic athlete at tight end who's hardly even really a tight end, but only in some ways, and in other ways, more of just a big wide receiver at, 6'4", 260 or whatever it is he's listed at nowadays. Obviously, things change. 6'4", 240, I think is what he was listed at, but we'll kind of see how that plays out once you get to the NFL, etc. But we've seen the Falcons do this with Kyle Pitts, and we saw the Buffalo Bills do this with Dalton Kincaid, and it at least sets some kind of a blueprint of okay, how could you make this work with Brock Bowers. The problem is it's not a one-to-one comparison, both in terms of who Brock Bowers is compared to those two tight ends, and it's not a one-to-one comparison in terms of what the Falcons and Bills had compared to what the Chicago Bears have, entering these respective rookie seasons. Those guys are the closest thing, and those situations are the closest thing, and I think there's some lessons we can take from them. I certainly think we can't let the shortcomings of the Atlanta Falcons offense, the way they really failed to get the most out of Kyle Pitts. That to me isn't enough to scare me away from drafting Brock Bowers. Like, I think there are reasons not to draft Brock Bowers, and I don't think that I would want to draft Brock Bowers per se. We'll get into some of the reasoning later, but like the fact that the fact that Kyle Pitts' production dropped off after his rookie season is not the reason not to draft Brock Bowers. Like, let's not forget Kyle Pitts was a 1,000-yard receiver as a rookie tight end, coming in out of that draft as the 4th overall pick in 2021. Like, clearly this thing worked. And you saw Dalton Kincaid this year as a rookie for the Bills. Again, half starter, kind of rotational player a little bit there, but still had almost 75 catches for almost 700 yards this season. Like, this kind of thing can work when you get a guy. I mean, I think Kincaid's listed at the exact same height and weight as Brock Bowers, 6'4", 240, whereas I think Kyle Pitts is considered a little bit taller, 6'6", and maybe even a little bit heavier, but kind of more stretched out and leaned out in that way as well. But like, you look at Kyle Pitts with the Atlanta Falcons, for example, his rookie season, that 1,000-yard year where he was at his absolute best, the way they used him, he played tight end 32% of his snaps. Literally, like, just under 1/3 of his snaps were at tight end. The other 68% of his snaps were at wide receiver. I believe there was one snap in the backfield that would count as 0.01%, so I'm not really including in the math here, but like 68% as a wide receiver, 32% as a tight end. Now, if you split that up between slot receiver and wide receiver, it's about 37% of his time in the slot, 31% of his time out totally wide, and then 32% of his time at tight end. So, I mean, it's close enough that you could almost go a third if you want to just do some loose rounding math. But Kyle Pitts' rookie season, his number one position, his primary use over the other spots was as a slot receiver. And that's where you could envision a similar kind of split and usage for someone like Brock Bowers, where we talked about it with Shane Waldron's offense. Like, Shane Waldron wants 3 wide receivers on the field. But if Brock Bowers can still be one of those wide receivers, but technically it would be a 2 wide receiver, 2 tight end personnel, but you would line him up the same way you would line up any other number 3 wide receiver. Could you start to piece together something like that could work with? So you'd have Keenan Allen and DJ Moore and Brock Bowers as your wide receivers, and then, Cole Kmet and or Gerald Everett rotating in as the other tight end. But is there enough playing time for all of them at that spot? I mean, that's where it becomes a little bit more challenging. And if you look at even somebody like Dalton Kincaid in particular, he spent half of his snaps, just under half of his snaps in the slot, even more time in the slot this season as a rookie than Kyle Pitts did as a rookie. And the vast majority of his time has been as a wide receiver. It's about a third of the time at tight end and 75% of the time at receiver, but just a little bit more slot, a little bit less wide was the role they found for him in Buffalo. And I feel like that would be more Brock Bowers. I don't know about Bowers as consistently playing outside as much as Kyle Pitts did. I think Pitts has a little bit more speed and a little bit more explosiveness in that regard. Not to say that Brock Bowers is not explosive and not fast, but like Kyle Pitts was like something even above and beyond, even more wide receiver-like, whereas Bowers is still a little bit more of a tight end, even though he is a lot of a wide receiver in that big body of his. I think he is a slightly better blocker than people give him credit for. Certainly a better blocker than Kyle Pitts. He's not George Kittle, right? He's not a dominating blocker who sets the edge in your offense or leads the point of attack, but he's very willing, good motor, and pretty decent form in that area of the game. The Georgia Bulldogs just didn't ask him to do like a crazy amount of that. And you look at his playing time in Georgia this past season, still primarily an inline tight end. I mean, every tight end is playing some in the slot and some at wide receiver and some in line. But when it comes to Brock Bowers, he was about 48% tight end, and then they used him in the backfield a little bit more. They used him as kind of a move around in a lot of different ways. And ultimately, like, just essentially rounded up to 50% tight end and then 50% receiver / backfield. He played a decent amount of the slot at Georgia, but not a ton out wide. And then again, like a little bit, they'd motion him into like kind of a hybrid fullback thing or in the shotgun next to the quarterback, or a kind of a wing off the line of scrimmage. So like you can find different ways to use him in your offense, the ways that Atlanta and Buffalo found for Kyle Pitts and Dalton Kincaid, respectively. It's a little bit different for Atlanta and Buffalo, though, because in Kyle Pitts' rookie season, I mean, part of the reason why he was able to have 1,000 yards and play so much receiver for them is that they really didn't have much else in that offense. That was the year Calvin Ridley got hurt. I remember he only played like 6 games a year. I'm pretty sure it was an injury thing. That was before the gambling issue in 2021, or was that... Did he get suspended mid-year for that, or was that in the offseason? Regardless, Calvin Ridley was their only wide receiver of note, and he only played 5 or 6 games. Their other wide receivers were Russell Gage, Olamide Zacchaeus, Christian Blake, Tajay Sharp, and Darby Frank. Like, Kyle Pitts played the most snaps of any of their skill position players. They did have other tight end depth, Hayden Hurst and a veteran like Lee Smith. Like, they had multiple tight ends, kind of like the Bears do now, but they had so little at wide receiver that Pitts could just be primarily a wide receiver, get a ton of targets out there, and be super productive. Whereas the Bears also have the tight ends, but also have a lot more at wide receiver. And are there going to be enough targets to go around where Keenan Allen can get the ball a bunch, DJ Moore can get the ball a bunch, Brock Bowers can get the ball a bunch, Cole Kmet still needs to get the ball sometimes. You're paying Gerald Everett $6 million. You got to get him the ball sometimes. And I get like having too many good weapons is a good problem to have. But we also have to account for like getting the most value out of not only the dollars you're spending on DJ Moore and Keenan Allen and Gerald Everett, but also the draft pick that you're using with the 9th overall pick, potentially taking someone like Brock Bowers there. Like that plays into how much this is worth it and how, the Falcons were able to just heavily utilize Kyle Pitts and just throw him the ball a ton because he was their best weapon and they were desperate for that kind of a player in their offense. The Bears, a little bit less so, or maybe I would say a bit less in terms of like desperate for that guy, but you could still use another weapon. But you compare that to like Dalton Kincaid on the Bills this year, right? They had Gabe Davis, they had Stephon Diggs, they also had Dawson Knox as kind of their number 1 tight end. So Kincaid could come in and kind of plug in sometimes at any spot, but didn't need to be relied on heavily over the top and could still be like under the radar a little bit as like the 4th or so option in there. And it worked well for them, but they weren't trying to juggle 2 other tight ends ahead of him in addition to 2 number 1 wide receivers ahead of him. Like they had Stephon Diggs and then Gabe Davis is a solid number 2, but I think we'd all agree that Keenan Allen and DJ Moore are better receivers than Gabe Davis and should get more targets, more catches, more involvement in the offense than a Gabe Davis. So it's like, it'd be like if the Bills had 2 Stephon Diggses and 2 Dawson Knoxes ahead of Dalton Kincaid. And I think it'd be a lot harder to find the kind of playing time and the role and the snaps, the targets for a Kincaid in that kind of situation like the Bears have compared to where in Buffalo, like, he could slot in nicely as that number 2. Like that's where it feels to me like Gerald Everett was the signing more so than the Keenan Allen trade that makes Brock Bowers harder for the Bears to draft. Certainly the Keenan Allen trade adds to that. But like Gerald Everett is in a similar type of mold of player of Brock Bowers. Certainly not the athlete Brock Bowers is, and certainly the ceiling for Brock Bowers is higher and all that stuff. But like if Gerald Everett is kind of again, poor man's Brock Bowers doesn't feel like a fair, exactly a fair kind of comparison there, but if he's going to be in that type of role already, it feels like there's even less room for Bowers at this point. I guess, is there a way to try and craft some kind of something? I mean, we'll look at like what that would look like. If you if you really had to force Brock Bowers into this offense, could you find enough playing time to go around? And then we'll kind of look at why it still feels unlikely that Ryan Poles is actually going to take Brock Bowers with the 9th overall pick or even after a potential trade down next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook, America's #1 sportsbook. The sports calendar is loaded right now, and FanDuel is making it even more exciting to get in on the action because right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. So you bet $5 on anything, the college basketball tournaments, NBA playoffs are right around the corner. Hockey playoffs right around the corner. You could bet on the NFL draft and prop bets there as well. $5 bet on anything. When your first $5 bet wins, they're going to add not only the winnings for your $5 bet, that get into your account, but also an extra $200 in bonus bets that you can use to bet on any of your favorite sports, all in the FanDuel app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. So to claim your $200 in bonus bets, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a big win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. At the end of the day, could the Bears find a role for Brock Bowers in this offense? I guess. I mean, Shane Waldron is a creative guy, and at some point you say, okay, give me a bunch of talented pass catchers, and I'll find a way to use them all. I'll find a way to get them all the targets that they need, and I'd rather have too many good guys than not enough good guys. But I also don't know that it's likely that once we get through the 9th overall pick, that Brock Bowers will be the best player available on Ryan Poles' draft board. It's hard to envision a scenario where that is specifically the case. Maybe if you trade down and Bowers is still there, he could be the #1 player on your draft board, but I'm still not convinced that the Bears are going to take him. So if you drafted Bowers and put him in this Bears offense, could he play the majority of his time as your number 3 receiver? A lot in the slot, but kind of rotating, can be outside sometimes with if Keenan Allen needs some time in the slot. Could you find 400 snaps for him in the slot this year, and then kind of have him occasionally also rotate in as the number 2 tight end with Gerald Everett, and maybe even sometimes he's the sole tight end on the field, and you give Cole Kmet a break there. Is there a path towards getting those guys some playing time, and maybe Keenan Allen at this age plays slightly less snaps? You give him slightly more breaks. You don't have him play every single snap, every single down, just to try and preserve him a little bit more. So then you play Bowers at receiver then. You could play Bowers and Gerald Everett at receiver then and have 3 tight ends on the field, but also look like you have 3 wide receivers on the field because Cole Kmet would be the only one at a tight end position. You can get excited about the versatility there, and you can feel like that's going to challenge defenses in some different ways. But at the same time, are you really getting the most out of Gerald Everett if he's competing with Bowers' snaps for the number 2 spot? Are you getting Cole Kmet, the big extension the Bears gave him? Are you really getting your $12 million a year worth out of Cole Kmet? Are you getting a 9th overall pick worth out of value of Brock Bowers? I don't want to be too hyper-focused on year 1 because, Gerald Everett's contract is basically a 1-year deal with a team option for the 2nd year, so Gerald Everett could be gone after 1 season, and then Brock Bowers is your number 2, and you build out from there. And certainly Keenan Allen's span in Chicago is not going to be crazy long, so you can find bigger roles. If you think big picture, sure, you can find long-term homes for Brock Bowers, and maybe you make it work year 1, but it's not ideal for anybody, but you get enough out of everybody that you can get through, and then in year 2 of Brock Bowers, then he can step into an even bigger role and really be that dynamic duo for Cole Kmet, and you can start to talk yourself into this. I'm just not convinced Ryan Poles will, because we've been talking about it all last week on the podcast and a little bit yesterday, these ideas of best player available with the 9th overall pick. When you've got edge rushers like Dallas Turner, Leatu Latu, Jared Verse, you've got offensive tackles like Joe Alt and Olu Fashanu that could be there. Any of the top 3 wide receivers, Malik Neighbors, Marvin Harrison Jr., Rome Odunze. I just listed 8 different guys that I think most of us would be happy taking over Brock Bowers there. And one of those 8 guys is for sure going to be there at 9. Probably 3 or 4 of those 8 guys are for sure going to be there with the 9th overall pick. And so it's just hard to envision a world where Ryan Poles looks at his draft board and says, yep, Bowers is the guy we have to have over all of these other potentially talented players. The exception there is maybe if you trade down 3 or 4 or 5 spots and Bowers is still there, although a lot of the rumors are that the New York Jets want Brock Bowers with the 10th overall pick, and maybe you could even trade up past the Bears to try and get Brock Bowers. I don't think they will trade up, but I'm not sold that draft rumor is 100% solid, but maybe you trade down and Brock Bowers isn't there. But I just come back to feeling okay, there's so many moving parts you have to finagle to really get the most out of Brock Bowers, at least in year 1. And is Shane Waldron and the Bears going to restructure their whole offense to fit this rookie tight end? You know what I mean? To try and, we got to play Keenan Allen a little less. We got to play Everett a little less. We got to play Kmet a little less. We got to move these guys around here so that we can get Brock Bowers this playing time because we used the 9th overall pick on him. That doesn't seem realistic to me that they're going to do all that to really get the most out of Brock Bowers. Again, like I get take the talented player and figure it out later, and I wouldn't be mad if the Bears drafted Brock Bowers. I'm not going to sit there and go, oh, what a wasted pick, what a dumb pick. No, I mean, I guess it would kind of depend on who they potentially passed on to take Bowers, but in a vacuum, I don't think it's the end of the world if you draft Brock Bowers. It just doesn't feel to me like it's good positional value. Tight ends, you can still generally find those guys later on in the draft. Tight ends don't get paid as much on their second contract, so you're not getting as much of like a financial savings by having them on a rookie deal as compared to what a second contract might cost for someone like Brock Bowers. Like, unless you just made him more or less almost a full-time wide receiver, then maybe you get wide receiver production out of a player you're only paying like a tight end, and it becomes easier. But, I mean, all this feels like a lot of work for a tight end here when you could just draft an edge rusher that you love, or draft an offensive tackle that you love, or draft a wide receiver that you love, and it becomes that much easier. Like, even if you get Rome Odunze at the 8th overall pick, like, you don't have to structure your whole offense around Rome Odunze. Like, at the end of the day, the priority here is structuring your offense around Caleb Williams. And if for some reason Ryan Poles identifies Brock Bowers as the player that's going to be really key, that key missing piece to aid Caleb Williams' development, like, I'm here for it. I'm open for that. But I think certainly one of the top wide receivers would be better and an easier fit to kind of make work here. And ultimately, you'd be able to get the most out of all your other guys by it being a true wide receiver as opposed to adding another tight end to an already well-stocked tight end room. And that's where I feel like, as much as I like Brock Bowers as a talent, and I think he's going to be a successful pass-catching weapon in the NFL and can go to the New York Jets or wherever and be very good. Like, is he going to be a Hall of Famer? I don't know, but like, he could be easily what Kyle Pitts has been up to this point in his career. Like, good. Like, more power to Brock Bowers. I'll be rooting for him. I think he's going to be a darn good player. Just not exactly the right fit at the right time for where the Chicago Bears are right now and what they have right now, as compared to a team like the Jets, where it's like, all right, like, they're trying to win right now. They got a veteran quarterback. They added Mike Williams at wide receiver to go with Garrett Wilson, so they're feeling a little better about that spot. But they really don't have a ton of proven production at tight end, and like, Bowers could come in as a rookie and like put them over the top on offense, right? Like, that could be kind of the missing piece to that Jets offense. Brock Bowers wouldn't be the missing piece to the Chicago Bears offense. It would be like another fun player to have that, okay, now we got to try and figure out how to make it work with all these fun players. But he's not like, man, all you need is Brock Bowers to put you over the top. And it feels like the Jets are, not that they're exactly there, but they're a lot closer to that point than where the Chicago Bears are. And whereas the Bears really need that edge rusher to put them over the top, or could use another, an offensive line upgrade to help put them a little more over the top, or, certainly a wide receiver could give them maybe the best 1, 2, 3 wide receiver trio in the NFL. If you had Malik Neighbors with Keenan Allen and DJ Moore, like that becomes a legitimate conversation about just where this Bears wide receiving core would rank at that point. So it's easier to get behind a lot of the other names that we've looked at for the 9th overall pick. And I think ultimately Ryan Poles will feel similarly and end up taking someone else, not because Brock Bowers isn't good, but because there are too many other better options for the Chicago Bears. I'd love to hear what you think about Brock Bowers and whether you want the Bears to take the Georgia tight end with the 9th pick or even after potentially trading down. Let us know in the comments here on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, or you can tweet us at Locked On Bears or post in the Locked On Bears Facebook group. However you do it, just make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. I really appreciate you making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We're getting you ready for draft day every single day as we inch closer. I still want to go through some sleeper prospects in this draft, some best and worst case scenarios for the Chicago Bears. We'll do a mock draft Monday coming up here really soon. I want to set some expectations for Caleb Williams and try and also be on the lookout for draft smoke screens that maybe we shouldn't pay too much attention to. And my theory is, and we'll talk about this, I think we're getting one right now there's been some budding hype about the Bears maybe really, really, really loving Malik Neighbors, and I think that's probably a draft smoke at this point that won't end up coming to fruition because Neighbors won't be anywhere close to where the Bears are when they pick. But we'll talk about that and some other things in the coming days here on the podcast. And no matter how we slice and dice this NFL draft and get you ready for draft day, we'll make sure to always make time for you to bear down.